Hey everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at the Contra release timeline. There's a lot of games. You can see this nice overview of the timeline. So let's go ahead and jump on in. Starting out, we have the original Contra, released back in the arcade in 1987. It was ported over to the PAL regions as Greiser. Pretty interesting fun fact for that. Up next, in 1988, the next year, Super Contra came out, also in arcades. That same year, Contra on NES was released. This is the first game. It was ported to the NES and it was renamed Pro Protector in PAL regions. 2 years later, in 1990, Super Contra was released, and yes, also retitled Pro Protector 2 in PAL regions. You're going to see that a lot. The next year, Operation C released. This is on the Game Boy, was the first portable installment, and it's very similar to Super C in many regards. The next year, Contra 3 The Alien Wars was released, also titled Super Pro Protector Alien Rebels in PAL regions. This was ported to the Game Boy and the Game Boy Advance later on, but definitely stick with that. Super Nintendo version's the best, obviously. That same year, Contra Force released. This is on the NES. This game is not necessarily a Contra game, but it does hold a Contra name, so yeah, we'll keep on chugging along. A few years later, in 1994, Contra Hardcore was released on the Sega Genesis, and this was strangely just titled Pro Protector in PAL regions. Just again, they just used the exact same name as the original Contra, Pro Protector. It was the first game in the Contra series released on a Sega platform, and the North American version was significantly more difficult as they removed the amount of hits that you could take from the Japanese version when porting it over here to North America. Now, 2 years later, Contra Legacy of War was released on the PlayStation. Now, this is an interesting one. It was supposed to be a direct sequel, but this was not developed by Konami directly. It was developed by Palooza Interactive, hopefully I said that correctly. It was also released on the Saturn, only in North America, came with some 3D glasses, but it never came out in Japan. Now, around this time, after that release, this game here, Contra Spirits 64, never was released, but was definitely rumored. It was first being talked about after Legacy of War during the development of the Contra Adventure, which we'll talk about here in a second. Here's a news article kind of mentioning some of the games that Konami was working on at the time, as well as Castlevania 64, Gradius 64, and of course Contra. Now, most of these never really happened, but this was a pretty big deal. It was something that was talked about for a few years here, and eventually the team that was behind this disbanded and would come back together working on Contra's Shattered Soldier in the future, which we'll take a look at. Now, the next year, C, the Contra Adventure, or just the Contra Adventure, was released in 1998. Like I said, this is the same time that the team over in Konami was trying to work on Contra 64, but never really materialized. This one was only released on the PlayStation in North America, and yeah, we'll move on. It'd be a few years before the new Contra game would come out. That team that was working on Contra 64, or at least early development, would come back together and work on Contra Shattered Soldier. This is returns to the two-dimensional gameplay, and it was also supposed to be a sequel to Contra Hardcore. So it seems like there's two lines from in terms of sequels from the Hardcore game from the Genesis. 2 years later, they would make another game, Neo Contra. It was a direct follow-up to Shattered Soldier. It was also the first game to receive an M rating in the Contra series. Now it'd be a few years before we would see another one, and this was Contra 4, released in 2007. This was developed by Wave 4 Technologies. As you can tell, a new development studio is kind of taken over here. This would be the only game they would develop. And 2 years later, M2 would get a chance to work on Contra with Contra Rebirth. This is a part of the Rebirth trilogy they worked on. This is only released on WiiWare and is no longer available for purchase. So let's keep going. A couple years later, in 2011, a new game, Hardcore Uprising, was developed by Arc System Works. It was only released digitally on the 360 and the PlayStation 3. It's supposed to be a spin-off to the Contra Hardcore series, as well as being a prequel. Very interesting that they did this. It's got a whole anime style. Very fun game. You can still buy it on the Xbox 360, so definitely recommend it, but it really, I think, hurt not having the Contra name there. I don't think a lot of people know about this one, but it's definitely a good game, so definitely check that one out. It'd be years and years later before last year Konami would release a new Contra game, Contra Rebirth. So this is kind of confusing because it has the core name at the end, or corpse, whatever you want to call it, but is a direct sequel to Contra 3. Confusing timeline. This one was developed by Konami themselves, apparently with Toy Logic. I guess they also helped out. But this one was criticized for its gameplay, graphics, and story. You know all about this. Go check out some of the Switch gameplay. Definitely underwhelming, a little bit disappointing, I suppose. I certainly hope Konami doesn't give up on the Contra brand. Really want to see something new come from it. But this is the newest game in the series, and yeah, this is all of them, so far anyway. I find it to be very funny how the timeline's more like a hill, showing less and less games coming out over time. So I hope you learned something. Let me know down in the comments, what's your favorite Contra game? And check back next week, we're going to be taking a look at the official Contra timeline. It's a little bit confusing, but we'll try and piece it together. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.